It's Newsmakers time, and joining us for a discussion about the news of the week as we see it here on ABC News 24, I'm joined by Larissa Behrendt, who's Professor of Law and Indigenous Studies at the University of Technology, Sydney, and welcome also to Julian Lisa, who's the Executive Director of the Menzies Research Centre. First, let's discuss the question of leadership in politics. John Howard released his memoirs this week, Lazarus Rising, and that's ignited an argument with his former deputy, Peter Costello, over whether he promised to hand over the leadership in 2006. Julian Lisa, what's your take on this latest leadership spat?
Well, I think it's sad. I like to remember the Howard government as a good government with John Howard, who's my favourite Prime Minister, and Peter Costello, who's my favourite Treasurer. I think the whole party bears some responsibility for the inability to manage the leadership issues in the last year of the government. And I think having this particular phase, and I understand why John Howard's wanted to put his view on the record, is a bit sad. It reminds me of when that book was released about Paul Hasluck, who was a Governor-General who was always well regarded, but it had a whole lot of bitchy vignettes about some of his former colleagues, and I think he was a bit diminished as a result of that book being published. So
you're sad that John Howard is being a bit bitchy, is that what you're saying?
Well, I don't think he's being necessarily bitchy. I think that the nature of the commentary around it has not reflected well on either man in this regard. I like to remember the man in the government as a strong and a very electorally popular Liberal government.
Larissa Behrendt, leadership challenges are not new. I mean, it happened between Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, obviously Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard. Should a deputy rightly assume for some reason that they should eventually take over?
Well, obviously a transition is a very important thing for the stability of the party, and I think it's a very rare thing that we see that done well. Probably Peter Beattie and Anna Bligh, Brax and Brumby are the very few examples you can point to where that's been a more successful transition. It is a rare thing. I think the nature of it is you have to have enormous ambition and drive to become leader of a party, to become Prime Minister. It's inevitable that once you're there, that ambition and drive will, want to continue. So it's not surprising that you see this. Memoirs come out like this that have a whole range of issues in it. It's often the leadership thing that's the thing that people pick up on because there's some interest around it. But I think Julian's right about one thing, and that is that it does actually often reflect, how that leadership is managed, that change is managed, does reflect a little bit on the person. It says something about their personality and their character.
I was just going to say, it's also important to remember that Peter Costello never had the numbers in the party room to challenge John Howard, and John Howard saw that as long as the party room wanted him to stay, he felt that he should stay, and I think you get some flavour of that from the book. Larissa's right, though. It's only a small part of what is a very long book.
I think it does change our impression of people once we see what really went on and the promises that were made and how they interpret those promises in a way. But let's move on. Another topic raised in John Howard's book this week was the Northern Territory intervention. John Howard referred to this in an interview this week, and first let's hear what he had to say.
We were satisfied that significant Indigenous leaders would support it. Some, of course, would strongly oppose it. But I guess we'd given the Northern Territory multiple opportunities to get their own house in order, and they hadn't. And if some more recent reports are to be believed, they still haven't.
That's John Howard. Julian Lisa, your response to John Howard's comments?
Well, I think the Northern Territory intervention was probably one of the most important policies of the Howard government. If you look what he says in his book, he said that he always felt that Indigenous communities needed to be mainstreamed and didn't believe in a policy of separate development. He particularly reacted very strongly to the Little Children the Sacred report, and that was the catalyst for this. But there'd been, for about 12 months, and the ABC deserves some credit for this, stories about abuse of children and women and alcoholism and violence in Indigenous communities resulting from some of Nanette Rogers' work that she was doing in the Northern Territory too. And I think John Howard took this extraordinary step because, as he said, he'd seen that the Northern Territory government was not addressing the problems in the way they should be addressed.
Larissa Behrendt, it still seems that there is a massive problem in the Territory. What's your response to what John Howard said, and indeed to the way that intervention is going now?
Well, I don't think that there's any difference of opinion about the fact that these issues need to be addressed. And I don't think that there's any doubt that John Howard's indication of the failure of the Northern Territory government to deal with these issues was a crucial thing. But there has been cost shifting between the federal and territory governments around Indigenous issues, just as there are on territory and on state and federal issues in the states. And that's been one of the problems. I think both sides of government need to take some responsibility for that. The criticisms about the intervention weren't about the motivation or the evidence that showed there were problems. It was about the delivery. And I think the sad thing is there was a lot of evidence at the time that critics of the intervention made that said these policies that you are putting in are not going to address these issues. It was said about the housing policy, which has been a complete failure, and it was said about the attempts to deal with child sexual abuse, and particularly criticisms around things like policing. So when we see research coming out now that says actually there has been no increase in arrest rates, the Australian Crime Commission was given additional powers. It found no evidence of the pedophile rings that were claimed to be operating at the time. What it shows is that these issues aren't being addressed because of the policy approach being incorrect. That's something that started under Howard, but it continued tenaciously under the Labor government. And I think when we see things like the government's own figures showing there's an increase in violence, there's an increase in malnutrition, there's an increase in childhood anemia rates, it really is time to go back and think about how these issues could be addressed more effectively.
Is there a sense of urgency in our hung parliament about it? Doesn't seem to be really top of the agenda at the moment, does it?
It's not been one of the issues that has been talked about at the moment, but I think, I think it's one of the things that the Rudd government has actually done not a bad job on in terms of continuing what the Howard government had started here. I'd just say on Larissa's point that there has actually been, according to the government statistics, a 17% increase in the number of prosecutions for assault. There are something like 600 children who've been seen by medicos as a result of the intervention. I think before the intervention, a lot of these things weren't even being reported, and that's been a big change.
If I could just maybe add this into that, the statistics show that the community-controlled health services did actually screen a larger number of children than the fly-in, fly-out doctors have, and there is some view that the children that weren't picked up by the fly-in, fly-out screening were the ones who were most at risk. And the other interesting thing around the arrest rates is that I think the impression, and certainly the urgency with the sort of work that Nanette Rogers did that you mentioned, was this view that there were adults that were preying on children. And what the arrest rates around sexual violence offending or sexual assault has been is that it's prosecutions of teenagers who are engaged in consensual sex with other teenagers who report to doctors. They're picked up as having sexually transmitted diseases. That gets reported, and then they get charged with an offence. And I'm not sure that's the exact scenario that was supposed to be targeted, or the one that's the most critical that we address. So I think there's a way to go to just target the issues that I think everyone agrees with.